Hello, everybody. Thanks for being here. We have, another big panel going on there, so there's a lot of, rivalry there, I guess, and competition. My name is Holger Kersten. I teach at the University of Halle in the eastern part of Germany, and I have a long-standing interest in Mark Twain. Clearly, this is my 8th Elmira conference. I don't know. Anybody else who has got that many? Oh, John. Yeah, of course. You've been there all the time. All right. My paper is called Jim in a New Light, and I want to make a few remarks about illustrations in Huckleberry Finn. I'll be showing a lot of slides, and it'll be fairly fast, but you're used to that. It's like you going through your Instagram feed and flipping through the images. I can't make comments on all of them, but I hope that you'll take the general gist of it. What's happening there? The current proliferation of visual images brought about and fed by the smartphone, YouTube, and Instagram has produced a heightened interest in the study of visual culture. At the same time, this flood of images makes it easy to forget that images played an equally important role in the earlier historical periods. Dazzled by the marvels of present-day visual technology, we risk regarding earlier moments in history as less exciting, less worthy of sustained attention when it comes to studying how earlier periods rendered the real and the fictional in visual form. 19th century audiences experienced a comparable excitement about visual materials. Mark Twain's Adventures of Huckleberry Finn, published with 174 illustrations by Edward W. Kemble, offers a particularly rich case in point. Yet despite this visual richness, the illustrations have received comparatively little sustained scholarly attention, and where critics have discussed them, the focus has often remained surprisingly narrow. To address these issues, this paper proposes a re-examination of the early illustrations of Mark Twain's Jim. Moving from a brief review of Kemble's 1885 drawings to the illustrations in the novel's first German illustrated edition from 1898, I would like to suggest that Jim's visual portrayal is best understood not as a fixed canonical caricature, but as a dynamic international tradition. There's little doubt that the illustrations deserve to be regarded as an integral part of Mark Twain's published works. Yet, this fact has found only limited expression in the standard reference works of Mark Twain's scholarship. A survey of the field reveals that illustrations have historically occupied a surprisingly marginal position. With the exception of one substantial entry in Greg Camfield's Oxford Companion to Mark Twain from 2003, none of the major reference works contains a separate chapter devoted to illustrations. This does not mean that the illustrations have been ignored altogether. Beginning in the mid-1970s, Beverly David played a foundational role in establishing the scholarly scrutiny of illustrations in Mark Twain studies. Through a series of influential articles, her commentaries in each volume of the Oxford Mark Twain, and her 2-volume Mark Twain and His Illustrators, published over the course of several decades, she documented the history of Mark Twain's collaborations with artists and provided a fruitful inspiration for subsequent scholarship. Other scholars like Barbara Schmidt, Harry Wanham, Stephen Railton, and others, this is not a complete list, added new insights and demonstrated further that the images constitute an important element in understanding both the meaning and the reception of Mark Twain's works. At the same time, a survey of the body of this scholarship reveals a striking pattern. Although almost all of Mark Twain's books were profusely illustrated, discussion has focused overwhelmingly on Adventures of Huckleberry Finn, and more specifically on the visual representation of Jim. In this context, Earl Briden's influential essay from 1988 on Kemble's images has played a significant role in shaping subsequent interpretations of the illustrations in Huckleberry Finn. Its influence is reflected in its frequent reprinting in widely distributed textbooks such as the Norton Critical Edition and the Bedford Books Critical Controversies Edition, of the novel, which disseminated Briden's argument to a broad audience of students and scholars. Briden argues that Kemble's illustrations of Jim draw on 19th century racial caricatures. In his view, these images shape the reader's understanding of the novel by undermining Twain's more complex portrayal of Jim and by reintroducing visual stereotypes that the text itself seeks to challenge. Ultimately, however, Briden's critical judgment extends beyond Kemble to Mark Twain himself. Because Twain approved Kemble's illustration, Briden argues he shares responsibility for his racialized representation, going so far as to suggest that Twain effectively, and I'm quoting Briden, sold Jim down the river himself. As Harry Wanham observes in his 2004 book, Playing the Races, Ethnic Caricature and American Literary Realism, Briden's interpretation became the foundation for a broader critical trend. Within this framework, many scholars have followed Briden's verdict. Wanham writes that all treating the exaggerated ethnic image as a regrettable mistake. Briden's essay has been highly influential, but its methodology raises fundamental questions that reflect a broader pattern in the interpretation of Kemble's illustrations. None of the studies undertakes a systematic and methodologically transparent examination of the complete corpus of the images. Briden and other critics following him place Kemble within the tradition of 19th century racial caricature, illustrating their point with examples drawn from Kemble's work outside of Adventures of Huckleberry Finn. These images are unquestionably relevant to understanding Kemble's artistic career. The question, however, is how much interpretive weight they should carry in determining the meaning of the illustration in Twain's 1885 novel. Another methodological issue concerns the selection of visual evidence. In his article, Briden reproduces a total of 16 illustrations by Kemble. Yet only 2 of these are taken from the 174 in the first edition of Adventures of Huckleberry Finn. No explanation is offered as to why these particular illustrations were selected, or whether they are representative of Kemble's treatment of Jim throughout the novel. These methodological concerns suggest the need for a more transparent and systematic approach. Rather than beginning with assumptions derived from the illustrator's biography or from work produced in other contexts, analysis should begin with the visual material that can actually be found in the novel itself. Such an approach might be guided by several principles. First, it should examine the overall visual character of the illustrations. Are they primarily rooted in the tradition of caricature, or do they employ a more realistic mode of representation? Second, it should examine the complete corpus of images rather than base conclusions on a small number of individual examples whose relationship to the larger pattern has not been established. In the case of Jim, this means first determining how many illustrations depict him and then considering the full range of these representations before drawing broader conclusions. Third, the criteria used to interpret the images should be made explicit. In much of the existing scholarship, judgment about the meaning of illustrations often rests on features such as facial characteristics, bodily posture, or spatial position within the visual composition. Yet none of these features possesses a fixed meaning. Prominent lips, enlarged eyes, or a crouching posture do not automatically constitute evidence of racial stereotyping. Their significance depends on the narrative context and on comparison with the depiction of other characters throughout the novel. For this reason, any interpretation should demonstrate how it is supported by the broader visual evidence. Applying such a methodology to Adventures of Huckleberry Finn presents a practical problem. In the printed book, the illustrations are dispersed throughout more than 300 pages. They cannot easily be viewed as a coherent body of visual material, nor can earlier or later illustrations be readily compared without repeatedly turning back and forth through the volume. As a result, a systematic observation of visual patterns is difficult. To overcome this limitation, one of my students and I have built an online research tool that enables a comprehensive examination of the complete corpus of illustrations in the books under consideration. At this point, the project is devoted to German illustrations of Huckleberry Finn before 1945, and we have included the original as well because it gives us a reference point. The tool is based on a full catalog of illustrations and allows users to filter images according to character, chapter, and other criteria. Rather than treating individual illustrations in isolation, it supports a range of research approaches, from examining all illustrations featuring a particular character to comparing selected images across editions or contexts. Here's an example of how this tool can support and enhance the study and analysis of images of Jim in Adventures of Huckleberry Finn. The following galleries, or you may look at them as some sort of contact sheets, have been created with the help of our tool. If all illustrations depicting Jim are displayed together, it becomes apparent that the image reproduced by Briden.
Oh. His fault again.
It becomes apparent that the images are reproduced by Briden, that the image he reproduces is not representative of Kemble's overall visualization of Jim. First contact sheet displays all images of Jim alone. The second and the third present those in which Jim appears together with Huck. Viewing the complete set of illustrations reveals a considerably broader and more varied visual record than the one suggested by the small number of images that have dominated the critical discussion. The limited time available today does not permit a discussion of every illustration. Instead, I would like to offer a few observations on selected images. Given Twain's well-known devotion to cigars, he would likely have appreciated the observation that sometimes a cigar is just a cigar. In the context of visual analysis, wide open eyes and an open mouth may simply convey shock or fear rather than a deliberate minstrel caricature. Likewise, it should not be forgotten that Kemble frequently depicts other characters in unflattering ways. Significantly, Briden himself reproduces one illustration of Huck and Jim together with the observation, Jim, and I'm quoting, "Jim is not attractively portrayed here in chapter 9, neither is Huck." My point is not to deny the presence of racial stereotyping in some of Kemble's illustration. Rather, it is suggests that the visual evidence is more varied and more complex than the prevailing critical narrative has generally acknowledged. Once the assumption that the illustrations are solely degrading is set aside, a number of illustrations come to the fore in which Jim is depicted as expressing a variety of emotional states: surprise, fear, grief, affection, or quiet reflection. Others depict moments of intimacy, mutual recognition, and companionship between Jim and Huck. The images collected on this slide illustrate these possibilities. One illustration deserves particular attention. In chapter 8, Jim appears on his knees before Huck, who is shown standing upright. Viewed in isolation, the image might easily be interpreted as reinforcing a hierarchy of racial subordination. In their notes to the critical edition of Adventures of Huckleberry Finn, however, the editors of the Mark Twain papers point out that this visual composition echoes one of the well-known emblems of the abolitionist movement, a kneeling enslaved man accompanied by the caption, "Am I not a man and a brother?" This is an opportunity for me to point to the footnotes in the edited volumes that come out of the Mark Twain project. I mean, I know that I'm preaching to the choir, but the amount of scholarship and the amount of knowledge that is involved there is just breathtaking, and sometimes we overlook that because people don't necessarily look at the reference material back there. First adopted in the 1780s as the seal of the Society for Effecting the Abolition of the Slave Trade, In England, the image circulated widely throughout the northeastern United States from the 1820s onward, appearing on pamphlets, stationery, broadsides, and in anti-slavery newspapers. And if you, superimpose this image onto the image by Kemble, it's striking how well it fits. The crouching posture. It's almost as if Kemble had seen some kind of a, had it before his eyes when he did this. And I also wanted to point out, whenever it's said that this is a moment of racial supremacy, look at Huck's face. I don't know if this, if this interpretation really holds. He looks concerned, he looks frightened, but he doesn't express superiority, I think, in that facial expression. Seen in this context, the image indicates that Kemble drew not only on the conventions of minstrel tradition, but also on abolitionist iconography, complicating the prevailing criticism that has treated his portrayal of Jim as uniformly stereotypical. Seeing Jim in a new light involves more than revisiting and re-evaluating Kemble's illustrations. As Twain works reached an international audience, they also acquired new visual forms. The international reception of Adventures of Huckleberry Finn reveals how the narrative inspired illustrators in other cultural contexts to envision the figure of Jim. Germany offers an especially revealing case. As Robert Rodney's 1982 study, Mark Twain International, demonstrates, Mark Twain's works enjoyed exceptional popularity in the German-speaking countries, where Adventures of Huckleberry Finn appeared in translation as early as 1890. 8 years later, in 1898, the Stuttgart publisher Robert Lutz issued the first illustrated German edition, featuring 51 drawings by the young artist Hans Schröter. Circumstantial evidence shows that Schröter was familiar with the illustrations from the English language original. In some cases, he followed Kemble's models, yet in others, yet even when the subject matter is the same, the visual treatment can differ noticeably. The German illustrations thus provide a distinct interpretive perspective on Jim. They demonstrate that viewing Jim primarily through the lens of American minstrel stereotypes risks obscuring the complexity of the ways in which illustrators have imagined and represented the character. So what's interesting this is, I think, an indication that Schröter knew the original, but it's also interesting, perhaps, if you look closely to see that he made certain kinds of changes. And if you want to accept that standing upright has a meaning, then he decided not to do that. And here's the same thing. I mean, you could argue, of course, Jim is on his knees because Huck is short, but Schröter tried to, knowing the original, he did it in a different way. All right, perhaps the most striking image to illustrate the point that Schröter came up with a different approach and a different interpretation is the depiction of Huck and Jim's reunion after in chapter 18, after the raft was struck by a steamboat. In this scene, Jim holds Huck in his arms and lifts him into the air, embracing him tightly. His face is turned upward, his eyes are wide open, his lips slightly parted in what appears to be a joyful smile. His expression conveys profound happiness and emotional absorption. Huck, in turn, clings to Jim with equal intensity. One leg is wrapped around Jim's leg, while one arm encircles his neck. Huck's head rests against Jim's cheek. Within the visual tradition of Adventures of Huckleberry Finn, the image is as unexpected as it is powerful. It presents the two figures, a black man and a white boy, as an intimate, almost sculptural unit, nearly a single body, whose physical closeness expresses mutual trust, care, and emotional intimacy. Here, racial difference recedes behind a visual language of human attachment. To conclude, let me return to the question raised in the title of this paper. What does it mean to see Jim in a new light? I have suggested that such a perspective requires both a more systematic examination of Kemble's illustrations and a willingness to look beyond Kemble. When considered in their entirety, Kemble's visualizations of Jim prove more varied than the critical tradition has generally acknowledged. At the same time, the German illustrations, as one example of the novel's international and visual reception, demonstrate that Kemble's Jim was never the only possible Jim. As Adventures of Huckleberry Finn crossed linguistic and cultural boundaries, its illustrators responded to Twain's narrative with images that both engaged with and departed from Kemble's example, thereby underscoring the narrative's capacity to generate alternative visual conceptions of Jim. Seeing Jim in a new light, therefore, means not only reassessing Kemble, but rethinking Jim's visual representation as a dynamic, evolving tradition rather than a single canonical image, one that extends across languages, cultures, and successive generations of illustrators. The notion of a minstrelized Jim has long dominated critical discussion. It should no longer eclipse the richer and more varied record of one of Twain's most significant characters. Thank you for your attention.